As Hashem is Baruch begin Perek Shisha, the 6th chapter in the Rambam Hilchos Berachos and the laws of blessings in the Seif Av, the book of love, which we continue regarding the brachas of Berachos Hamazon and regarding the bracha of Hamaitzi, which is on the bread meal. Related to that, this perek discusses the halacha of the netilas yadayim, of the washing of the hands, which Rambam begins halacha of regarding the obligation of the washing and how to qualify this halacha. So kol oichel pas, whoever eats bread, shemavarchim of Hamaitzi, and this is why we're bringing it here. It's in the bracha of Hamaitzi. You make a bracha of Hamaitzi, and then so tzarich netilas yadayim tchil b'seif. You have to wash your hands before the meal and at the end of the meal. And this is vav pishi paschul, and even though it's unconsecrated bread, it's not truma, which hands which are only a secondary tumah would not invalidate chulin because there's a general rule that chulin cannot become a shlish l'tumah. Even so, and vav pishi ein yodam meluchlachis, and even if its hands are not dirty, so you wouldn't have to wash it because of cleanliness. And any day lehem tumah, you don't know that the hands have any impurity on it. Lo yechel, one should not eat until he washes both hands. And the reason for this is because, as a concern for truma, because generic hands would invalidate truma if you don't wash them, because generally hands are engaged and they're busy and they touch one's flesh, and it's also disgraceful truma if you touch it with filthy hands, which becomes disgusting for those who eat it. And so that people should be accustomed, when you're eating truma, to wash your hands, so they instituted the same thing would be for chulin, also for regular bread, for a regular person too. And actually anything also that is dipped into a beverage, into a liquid, also one has to wash one's hands first. And the reason for that is because liquids that touch regular hands actually become a rishon l'tumah, which is something unique about the halachas of mashkin. That would contaminate even chulin, like a vegetable that you're dipping, which is what we do with the Seder night, and therefore one would have to wash one's hands then too. Halacha beis, kol noikel yadav. Whoever washes his hands, Ben lachila, because whether he's coming to eat a bread meal, like we said, or ben lakrishma, whether when he's coming to say Shema, ben tefillah, whether for Shema Ne'eser, for davening, when you're supposed to wash your hands before you have a tefillah. Any type of netilas, yadayim, mevarch, tchili, you first make a bracha, asher kedeshanu, b'mitzvaysa, b'tzavanu, that Hashem they sanctified us in His commandments, and they commanded us, al netilas yadayim, on the washing of one's hands. Because shazum mitzvah chacham. What do you mean Hashem commanded us? Yes, because it's a rabbinic mitzvah, but it's tavinim in the Torah, the shmei mahan, but we were commanded from the Torah, from Hashem, to listen to them, and hence it's Hashem commanded us. Because Hashem says a pasuk in Devarim, al pi Torah sheirucha, based on the Torah, that they instruct you, referring to the sages. And therefore that's considered Hashem commanded us in this mitzvah. Now, however, the later waters after the meal, you don't make a blessing on that washing, because it's not a mitzvah per se, it's only because of danger. So therefore one has to be very careful about them, because we know the rule that danger is more important than prohibition, but there's no bracha because it was instituted only because of safety. Halacha Gimel. Netilas yadayim bin tavshel tavshel. Washing one's hands between one dish and another dish. Rishus is optional. Ratza neitel, if he wants to wash, he could. Ratza ein neitel, if he wants to, he doesn't have to wash his hands. Now, a perish al chulin, regarding unconsecrated fruits, in the tzichin, one does not have to wash his hand, bin betchila, bin meseb, whether before he eats it, whether after he eats it. Whoever washes his hands when he's coming to eat fruits, is considered arrogant, as if he's very meticulous in halacha, which is unnecessary. Now, kol pas, any bread that you have salt with it, one would have to wash his hands after he finishes his meal, which is what we spoke about, the mayim achreinim, because shemi yesh by melech sedaim, it might have the salt from sedaim, oy melech, which is a certain place, oy melech shetibik melech sedaim, or the salt which its nature is like the nature of this stem salt, and v'yava yodav al einav, and he might put his hands over his eyes, and it might blind him. So because of this, therefore that's why one has to wash his hands at the end of every meal, because of this concern, because of that salt. Now, actually, by a camp where they're going out they're fighting a war, they're exempt from washing their hands before the meal, because they're very busy with the war, and we don't obligate them in this rabbinic mitzvah until it's time. But they are obligated in the mayim achreinim because of the danger. So it doesn't make a difference if you're in war. Definitely you have to be concerned for danger there too. Until where does one have to wash his hands? So out of parak up until the joint, which is the wrist that connects the hand and the arm. How much is the measurement of how much water you have to have? So it's revius l'chosh yadayim. It's a quarter of a log of water for every pair of hands, for every two hands. And whatever is considered interposition, something that gets in the way when one is immersing in the mikvah, would also be considered as an interposition, as getting in the way of the washing of the hands, that it would be invalid. Now, whatever is counted to supplement and to complete the measurements of the mikvah, for example, let's say snow or types of liquidy mud, would also go to supplement the measurement of the revius of the water from the Netilas Yadayim. Now, halacha regarding not netilas yadayim, but actually tevilas yadayim, immersing one's hand in the mikvah. Whatever needs washing the hands, the hitbal yada b'mei mikveh, and he dips his hands instead into the waters of a mikveh, gathered waters that has 40 saw, and the tzarech daracher actually doesn't need anything else. Meaning, for the Tuesday, as we'll see in halacha tezayin, you have to lift up your hands, and in halacha chaf we'll see you have to draw your hands. When you do tevilas yadam, you don't require anything else. Now, the mitvilim b'mayim, but if you dip your hands into water, she'im b'm shir mikveh, they don't have the measurement of a mikveh, or b'mayim shuv b'karka, or just gathered waters in the ground. You haven't done anything. Because you can't have drawn waters at a matar nisidayim to purify the hands. You could use drawn waters if you're pouring it, but dipping would have to be into valid mikvah waters. Regarding the conditions of the waters that are being used for netilas yadayim, whoever's washing his hands, has to be careful with the following four things. Regarding the water itself, that it should not be invalid for the washing of the hands. The measurement that has to have a quarter of a leg for every two hands that it's washing. Has to be a vessel that the water has to be taken through a vessel. And number four, when you're taking the water, when you're washing them, it's being poured, has to be from the force of a giver. So regarding the first thing that you have to be careful for regarding the water, there's four things that invalidate the water. Shinmara, change of color, Vekilu being left uncovered, Vesis Malachaban if work was done with it, and the Hefsit Shemanias Beim, Malicious Beim, anything that would detract, that would prevent an animal from drinking from it, that it's so ruined, are four invalidations. So regarding the first thing that we mentioned. Regarding water that changed colors, whether it's in vessels, whether it's in the ground, whether it changed color because something fell inside of it, whether because of its place that it's in, either way, it would invalidate it. And this the other halacha. So if it was uncovered, which would prohibit it from drinking because maybe a snake drank from it and put in its poison, which, as the Rambam says in Hilchos Berachos Chapter, that one would be forbidden to drink it, that would also invalidate it from washing one's hands with it. Halacha ches, the next item that we had would invalidate it. Any water that work was done with it. So nasu sheifchen becomes like spilled out, meaning like sewage water. It's invalid to use for washing the hands. How so? So if you have drawn waters which were used to wash out vessels, or he soaked his bread inside of it. Okay, so something like that. It was used for some type of purpose. Whether it's in vessels or in ground, that would invalidate it for the washing of the hands. However, if you washed out vessels, new vessels, that wouldn't invalidate it. That wouldn't be considering it as wastewater. Regarding water that the baker dips in the ka'achim, which are these dry and round cakes, they're pretzels, psulim, that would invalidate the water. Now, but if he takes a handful of this water when he's kneading the dough, meaning after he forms the bread, he smears on the surface some water, sometimes by dipping the bread in the water, sometimes taking his hands and taking out a handful of the water and smearing on the surface of the bread. So if he cupped out some of it when he's kneading, shem, it's going to be valid because the water that were in his palms, that's the water that you did malacha with it. That's on the bread. But the water that he took a handful from them, that retains its validity because that he didn't do anything with it. That's still remaining, and therefore the water could be still used. Halacha tes. And regarding the last thing that we mentioned of the four things of the water, any water that becomes invalid for a dog to drink from it. For example, shayimar, they were bitter. I'm looking salty, akurin, or murky, or richim ra has a bad smell. Actually, until it's so bad that a dog wouldn't drink from it. So, bekalim in vessels, you can't use that cup, let's say, to pour for washing one's hands. But if it's in the ground, so that would be valid to dip one's hands into, because the gezeres are only said regarding the washing that one should not become to the grave. But if it's in the ground, that they didn't decree. Now, Chami Tveria, the hot waters of the spring waters of Tveria, which are not fit for a dog to drink from because they're bitter. So bim coming, but if they're in the original place, matbil memzidam, you could dip your hands into it, like the halacha of water in the ground. I'm not remember clean, but if you took those waters with washing with a vessel, or you separated a stream to go to another distinct area, which are not connected anymore to the spring waters, Then you cannot wash from them, not mayim rishonim, and not mayim achronim, because beforehand we said it's not fit for a dog, and after the eating, because the water will not remove the filth because they're hot, and you cannot rub with them, as the Rambam is going to say in Halacha Zayin. And the reason is, this is going back on the reason why you cannot use them before you eat, because it's only valid for when you're washing with a vessel, only fit for the drinking of the animal, and here an animal wouldn't drink these waters. Now, moving on to the next thing that you have to be careful for, which is the measurement of the waters. Yesh la noitel, that the one should have for when they're taking, litin al yad mat ma'at, he could, to pour the water a little bit, achit and kashir, until he pours the whole measurement on his hand. Now, if he puts the whole quarter of a leg in one pour, kosher, that's also valid. You could have 4 or 5 people washing their hands, one on the side of the other. Meaning, let's say one person is pouring on all their hands. Or let's say even not on the side of each other, so he's pouring, he's going from one to the next. You could even have one on top of the other one's hands in one pour. So even though the upper waters became tummy from the upper hands, they will still purify the person's lower hands because they're all considered like one hand, which does not become impure from the other part of the hand. Now, but as long as their hands are loose, that the water could get between them to get the ones of the hands beneath the upper one's hands. Moreover, you have to have that one pour is that you have a revis of water for every single person's pair of hands. Halacha Yud Aleph, regarding the next item, regarding the vessel that's used for the washing of the hands. You cannot take the water to wash for the hands, not with the walls of a vessel, which mean they broke, but you could hold water in the wall, but since it does not hold it, only if it's being supported, it's not considered as a vessel in halacha. And it's not with a large earthenware vessel, which it wasn't made to receive water, so you can't wash with it, which is the bottom of this samavar. Not with earthenware shards, which again it could only hold it if it's supported. And not with the cover of a barrel, which even though it has a receptacle, but it's pointy, and also it cannot hold itself unless it's supported, so it's not considered a vessel. Now, but if you fixed the cover that it should be for washing, meaning you widen the bottom and therefore now it could hold it even if it's not being supported, then you could take it for washing one's hands. So if you have a flask made out of leather that was prepared, where you made a place where it could sit, then you can use it to wash one's hands. Of a sock, but regarding a sack or a basket that was prepared where to sit without being supported, and you also tarred it so that it could hold water, in the memory dam, you can't use it to wash one's hands because it's not made to receive water, it's only meant to hold dry things. Neither should he go and wash his friend's hands with his handful, because your hands are not a vessel. Now, a vessel that had a certain break, that would be a break big enough, as the Rambam explains elsewhere in the halachas of Tumah and Tahara, what would be considered as something that would purify a vessel, as in Rambam says Hilchos Berachos Chapter Yutes, as it's brought in Mishnayos in Masechtas Kelim, that would break a vessel, purified from its laws of Tumah. So so then you can't use those vessels either for washing one's hands. They're considered halacha as broken vessels. It's not considered as a complete vessel, and that's why it purifies it from the laws of Tumah. With all vessels one could use to wash one's hands, but for the even if it's vessels made out of dungware, meaning from animal feces, or vessels made out of earth that wasn't heated up in the oven, so it's not considered cheres. But as long as they're intact. Now, however, if you have a vessel that it can't hold a revius, or doesn't actually have a revius, you can't use it to wash one's hands. It has to hold a revius and actually have a revius. Regarding, it has to have the force of a giver. Everyone's valid to wash for the hands. Even if a deaf mute, the mental range of a cotton and a minor. Now, let's say there is no one else, not even a child. So what he does is he puts the vessel between his lap, and his legs will assist in the pouring. And but that's how he'll pour it onto his hands together. Or what he'll do is is that he'll tilt the barrel onto his hands, and that's how he'll wash. So it's coming from a nissen because the water is pouring because he tilted it. Or what you do is you just don't do both hands at the same time. You take one hand, and then you pour from one hand on the other hand. Then you go and you pour from the first one onto the second one. And actually, even a monkey could wash for one's hands because you don't need the force of a person. You just need to have a nice, and that could even be as a monkey. Halacha Yadal. Now regarding hashekis, regarding a trough, which is this vessel, that hollow stone that's by the edge of the spring or the well, and the shadola adam b'yoda begalgal. So it depends. What happens is that the person draws out the water either with his hand or with a wheel. Now he puts it into the trough. And the water, it flows from it in the canal. And then through the trough, which you pour the water into, it goes out and waters the vegetables of the animal. So here, is this valid of netila, of koich hanoisin? So it depends. If the person puts his hands into the trough, so then the water passes over because it's flowing out, and it washes over his hands. So in general, netila, it's not going to be considered as a valid washing. There's no one putting the water onto his hands because the original force that he had done, the one who was drawing the water, already stopped. It's ceased. You don't see it anymore. And now it's the natural flow. So it's not coming from a koich hanoisin. But if his hands was very close to the pouring of the bucket, it's like until it happens that the water that pours on his hands is really from the force of the person who placed it over there, then also the netila. Then the netila would work for that individual. You still see that force that was the original pouring on his hands that they're in the trough. Now, halacha tezvav, regarding in general different doubts that come up in the halachas and the tilas yadayim. Mayim shenistabik loyim nasim malacha. Let's say you have water that you're not sure if work was done with it or loy work was not done with it, which, as we mentioned, that's one of the invalidations. Or let's say you're not sure yeshbem kashir that has the measurement. Not you don't have an actual measuring cup on you, or it doesn't have the measurement, or imhim tayin ma'tamim, or was it pure or impure, which would invalidate it. Or Safek Natal Yadav, he's not sure, did he wash his hands? Safek Loy Natal Yadav, did he not wash his hands? He doesn't remember. So all these cases, Sveik Tar, the doubt's going to be pure, meaning we're going to consider his hands as pure. Shekol Safek Shebetaz Yadayim Tar, all doubts regarding the halacha of purification of the one's hands is going to be considered as pure. Halacha design regarding how does one actually go ahead and wash his hands. So Ma'im Rishayim, the first waters before the meal, so after you wash your hands, when you're washing your hands, you have to lift up your hands upwards. Because we don't want that water should go out of beyond the wrist, meaning that was originally on the hand, and it goes out beyond the wrist, and then to come back. Meaning, because if you're going to put your hands down, so then it could go out and then back down from the wrist. It's going to contaminate the hands. Why? Because what happens is that, okay, they became tamei when they were on the hands itself, where it's getting rid of the tama. Now, even if generally what happens is you could pour second waters which purify the first waters, but the problem is in this case you wouldn't be able to because the secondary waters only purifies the waters while they're still within the hand. Once it pours out, so then it wasn't purified by the second waters, but now then the original waters come back, it's going to contaminate the hands. You have to make sure you lift up your hands, you keep them up so that they drip down beyond that direction and not to come back down on the hands, recontaminating the hands. But to the contrary, the waters after the meal, the person actually has to keep them lower downwards because we want all the force of the salt that's there to come off his hands to go drip downwards and come out. It shouldn't be on his body. Now, the first waters could be washed, whether on a vessel, whether on the ground, doesn't make a difference. The later waters, could only be washed onto a vessel because there's an evil spirit resting on them. And therefore, you could do it on a vessel that will contain it, not on the ground where people are going to traverse. Also, another discrepancy is the first waters could be washed, or whether with water heated up on the fire, whether they're cold waters. The later waters cannot be taken if they're hot. Meaning as long as they're problematic if they're so hot that a hand would recoil from them. Because when they're very hot, they cannot remove the filth, which because you cannot rub with them, and the whole thing is you have to get rid of that because inside there might be this sediment salt, which would be dangerous. But if they were lukewarm, then you can even wash with them in the Mayim Achrein. Halacha Zayin, regarding those that are exempt from the Tila Siyadayim, and regarding being careful regarding the Tila Siyadayim. So, Noitel Adam Yod B'Shachas. A person could technically wash his hands in the morning, and they could stipulate on them regarding the whole day. Now he's exempt. He doesn't have to wash his hands for every single time he sits down for an eating session. But as long as that he did not remove his consciousness from them. But if he removed his consciousness from them, then he has to go ahead and wash his hands every single time that he needs a netila when he's sitting down for an eating session, or anything that he needs netila for. Tefillah, all the different things, because he was Masir Das, he removed his consciousness from that. A person can wrap his hands in a cloth, and he can eat bread with them. Or something that is dipped into liquid, which also requires netila, even though he did not wash his hands, because he's not concerned that he's going to touch his hands because it's wrapped in a cloth. So he's also exempt from netila zedam. Now, someone's feeding others, also in the tzarchim zedam, does not have to wash their hands, because it was only instituted for the one who's eating themselves. But the one who's eating, tzarchim zedam, has to wash their hands, even though someone else is putting it into his mouth. He's not touching the food, it doesn't make a difference. So if someone's eating with a shovel, a fork, that you have to wash your hands, because that was the way Chazal instituted. You cannot eat these foods like bread without washing your hands. It's forbidden to feed someone who didn't wash their hands, even if you're putting directly into his mouth. It's forbidden to degrade the halach of washing one's hands. And there are many commands that the sages command to and they warned us regarding this thing. Even though it only has enough water for the amount of drinking, you have to wash your hands with some of them, and then you could eat and drink the other remaining, but that's how important the washing your hands, even if you have enough just to drink, you have to use that for washing your hands. A person has to dry his hands, and only then eat. Whoever eats without first drying off his hands from the washing, it's like eating impure bread. Whoever washes his hands at the end of the meal, Menagib also has to dry, and then he makes Berachos Hamazon. And moreover, taken for Lantil Zedayim immediately after washing the hands of Mayim Achreinim, Berachos Hamazon should be the benching. You should not interrupt between them with anything else. Even to drink some water after he washed his hands at the end of the meal, it's forbidden until he first makes the Berachos Hamazon. It has to be immediate after Mayim Achreinim is the benching.